So here's a question for you. Is free speech in the UK a fundamental right? Well, a fascinating analysis suggests the answer is actually no. And the reality of what you're allowed to say might just surprise you. Let's break it down.
Okay, so the core argument is this. Britain doesn't have foundational free speech, not in the way the US has its First Amendment. What it has instead is something called conditional tolerance. So try to think of it less like a guaranteed inherent right and more like a permission slip that comes with a whole lot of terms and conditions.
And what does conditional tolerance actually mean in the real world? Well, as you can see here, it basically means your speech is fine, right up until it bumps into a legally defined limit. It's not some wide open field of expression, it's more like a field with some very specific legally built fences around it.
This all leads to a bit of a paradox. We often talk about free speech as this ancient, bedrock British value, but the modern reality is something else entirely. It's a qualified idea, one that's constantly being shaped and renegotiated by the courts, and, of course, public opinion. So how does this actually work? Let's break down the 5 key legal limits where this so-called conditional tolerance runs out. These are the big justifications rooted in the Human Rights Act that basically give the state the green light to step in and restrict speech.
All right, first up, and this one is a biggie, national security. This is an area where Parliament has come down really hard, most famously with things like the Official Secrets Acts, giving the government some serious power to shut down expression.
And here's where things get really interesting. On the one hand, you have the David Shaler case, where UK courts basically said national security can beat public interest, even when a former MI5 officer is the one talking. But on the other hand, the European court's ruling in the famous Spycatcher case set a really important limit. Once the cat's out of the bag and the info is public, you can't just keep using national security to suppress it forever. It's like the justification has a shelf life.
Okay, limit number 2 is public safety. This gets used when speech is seen as creating a direct, real-world risk of physical harm or some kind of major disruption. This is all about stopping immediate danger in its tracks.
And the key thing to remember here is that you need real, solid evidence. Restrictions are only okay for immediate, tangible threats, not for what our source material calls precautionary anxiety. You can't just restrict speech because you're nervous about what might happen. The danger has to be real and it has to be pressing.
Next up, number 3, and this is one you see all the time, preventing disorder or crime. This is what draws that absolutely crucial line between just expressing an offensive opinion, which is usually legal, and actively encouraging someone to break the law, which definitely is not.
And check out these 2 cases, because they make the difference crystal clear. In the Chaudhary case, speech that invited support for a banned terrorist group was pretty obviously illegal incitement. But now contrast that with Redmond Bait, which established that you can't be shut down just because your lawful speech makes a crowd angry. The court basically said, hey, it's the police's job to handle the angry mob, not the speaker's job to shut up. All right, number 4 is a tricky one. It's probably the most broad and, honestly, subjective of the bunch. Protecting public health or morals. This one gives Parliament a ton of room to draw lines around what it considers obscene or extreme. And again, you see this really fascinating balancing act. The Peacock case shows that yes, distributing extreme material can be restricted to protect public morals. But the check on that power comes from this really important European legal idea that's been around for ages. Free expression also has to protect ideas that offend, shock, or disturb. Just being offensive isn't enough to get something banned.
And that brings us to our 5th and final limit, the protection of the reputation or rights of others. This is basically the bedrock of laws like defamation and harassment, and it's all designed to stop serious harm to individuals.
And this distinction is so important for understanding who you can criticize. Private individuals are protected from serious harm to their reputation. But, and this is a big but, public bodies are fair game. The courts decided that letting the government sue for libel would put a chilling effect on political debate. I mean, in a democracy, you've got to be able to call out the people in charge, right? Okay, so we've gone through all these legal limits. What does it all actually mean for you in the real world? Let's try and boil this all down into a super practical guide for figuring out your risk level when you decide to speak out. Just think of it like a risk pyramid. Down at the bottom, at the wide, stable base, you're on really safe ground. Criticizing big systems, institutions, political parties, ideas, that's all very low risk. As you move up a level to criticizing specific public officials, the risk goes up a little bit. And right at the very top, where you're criticizing private individuals, That's where you have the least legal protection and the highest risk. But there is an absolute bright red line in all of this. When speech stops being about ideas and starts targeting people because of who they are, their race, religion, sexuality, or a disability, that's where UK law puts its foot down, hard. The legal protections that speakers usually have, they fall away, and they fall away fast. And you've got to remember, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. Context is everything. Perfectly legal words can become illegal depending on the situation, like if they're part of a campaign of harassment or if they're delivered in a threatening way. The courts look at the whole picture, not just the words on a page.
So, when you put this whole system together, this idea of conditional tolerance that's built on complicated court cases instead of a simple, clear rule, it has this huge cultural side effect. It's something known as the chilling effect.
So first off, you've got the law itself, which, as we've just seen, is super complex, right? It's not a clear rule book. The goalposts are always moving, being pushed and pulled by courts, regulators, and public pressure.
Then you mix that legal gray area with a culture that's, well, pretty anxious about causing offense. People and organizations are thinking just as much about the social fallout or professional backlash as they are about any actual legal trouble.
So what happens when you mix vague laws with an anxious culture? You get a chilling effect. It's not necessarily the government overtly censoring people, it's that people and institutions just quietly censor themselves. They play it safe to avoid the risk. And so speech gets shut down, not because a judge ordered it, but out of an abundance of caution. And that can affect everything from journalism to art.
And that really leaves us with the final big question that this whole analysis brings up. It makes you look past the courts and ask a tougher question. In this world of conditional tolerance, what if the real limits on our speech aren't coming from the state anymore, but from ourselves? Now that is something to think about.